Welcome to Theories of Surplus Value on Weekly Marks, 12 April 2025. We've been looking at, in this particular instance, I've been looking at Theories of Surplus Value complete set. Some may consider it Volume 4 of Capital, of which we're doing Volume 1, the 2024 edition, the Princeton edition, on Sunday, tomorrow. Today, Chapter 3, Volume 1, in Theories of Surplus Value. It's read by Andrew Reitenberg, and we thank him for that. I will be doing some annotation in the chat while we go through this, which I guess I'm going to save and make available. You can get the complete set of Theories of Surplus Value online, and that's the version from which we're going to be operating.
In opposition to this, for the mercantile system in fact denies the creation of absolute surplus value, the physiocrats seek to explain absolute surplus value, the net product, and since the net product is fixed in their minds as use value. Chapter 3. Adam Smith. Section 1. Smith's two different definitions of value: the determination of value by the quantity of labor expended, which is contained in a commodity, and its determination by the quantity of living labor which can be bought in exchange for this commodity. Adam Smith, like all economists worth speaking of, takes over from the physiocrats the conception of the average wage, which he calls the natural price of wages. Quote, "A man must always live by his work, and his wages must at least be sufficient to maintain him. They must even, upon most occasions, be somewhat more, otherwise it would be impossible for him to bring up a family, and the race of such workmen could not last beyond the first generation." Adam Smith expressly states that the development of the productive powers of labor does not benefit the laborer himself. He says, quote, "The produce of labor constitutes the natural recompense or wages of labor. In that original state of things, which precedes both the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock, the whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer. He has neither landlord nor master to share with him. Had this state continued, the wages of labor would have augmented with all those improvements in its productive powers, to which the division of labor gives occasion. All things would gradually have become cheaper. At any rate, all those things requiring a smaller quantity of labor for their reproduction. But they not only would have become cheaper, they have, in point of fact, become cheaper. They would have been produced by a smaller quantity of labor, and as the commodities produced by equal quantities of labor would naturally in this state of things be exchanged for one another, they would have been purchased likewise with the produce of a smaller quantity. But this original state of things, in which the laborer enjoyed the whole produce of his own labor, could not last beyond the first introduction of the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock. It was at an end, therefore, long before the most considerable improvements were made in the productive powers of labor, and it would be to no purpose to trace any further what might have been its effects upon the recompense or wages of labor." Here, Adam Smith very acutely notes that the really great development of the productive power of labor starts only from the moment when it is transformed into wage labor, and the conditions of labor confront it on the one hand as landed property, and on the other as capital. The development of the productive power of labor thus begins only under conditions in which the laborer himself can no longer appropriate its result. It is therefore quite useless to investigate how this growth of productive powers might have influenced or would influence wages, taken here as equal to the product of labor, on the hypothesis that the product of labor, or the value of this product, belonged to the laborer himself. Adam Smith is very copiously infected with the conceptions of the physiocrats, and often whole strata run through his work which belong to the physiocrats and are in complete contradiction with the views specifically advanced by him. This is so, for example, in the theory of rents, etc. For our present purpose, we can completely disregard these passages in his writings, which are not characteristic of himself, but in which he is a mere physiocrat. In the first part of this work, when dealing with the analysis of the commodity, I have already pointed out Adam Smith's inconsistency in his treatment of how exchange value is determined. In particular, how he sometimes confuses, and at other times substitutes, the determination of the value of commodities by the quantity of labor required for their production with its determination by the quantity of living labor with which commodities can be bought, or what is the same thing, the quantity of commodities with which a definite quantity of living labor can be bought. Here, he makes the exchange value of labor the measure for the value of commodities. In fact, he makes wages the measure, for wages are equal to the quantity of commodities bought with a definite quantity of living labor, or to the quantity of labor that can be bought by a definite quantity of commodities. The value of labor, or rather of labor power, changes like that of any other commodity, and is in no way specifically different from the value of other commodities. Here, value is made the measuring rod and the basis for the explanation of value, so we have a vicious circle. From the exposition that follows, however, it will be seen that this vacillation and this jumbling up of completely heterogeneous determinations of value do not affect Smith's investigations into the nature and origin of surplus value, because in fact, without even being aware of it, whenever he examines this question, he keeps firmly to the correct determination of the exchange value of commodities, that is, its determination by the quantity of labor, or the labor time expended on them. Many examples can be given to show how often in the course of his work, when he is explaining actual facts, Smith treats the quantity of labor contained in the product as value and determining value. Some of these are quoted by Ricardo. His whole doctrine of the influence of the division of labor and improved machinery on the price of commodities is based on it. Here, one passage will be enough to cite. In chapter 11, Adam Smith speaks of the cheapening of many manufactured goods in his time, as compared with earlier centuries, and he concludes with the words, quote, "It cost a greater quantity of labor to bring the goods to market. When they were bought thither, therefore, they must have purchased or exchanged for the price of a greater quantity." Secondly, however, this contradiction in Adam Smith and his passing from one kind of explanation to another is based upon something deeper, which Ricardo, in exposing this contradiction, overlooked or did not rightly appreciate, and therefore also did not solve. Let us assume that all workers are producers of commodities, and not only produce their commodities but also sell them. The value of these commodities is determined by the necessary labor time contained in them. If, therefore, the commodities are sold at their value, the laborer buys with one commodity, which is the product of 12 hours labor time, another 12 hours labor time in the form of another commodity. That is to say, 12 hours labor time, which is embodied in another use value. The value of his labor is therefore equal to the value of his commodity. That is, it is equal to the product of 12 hours labor time. The selling and buying again, in a word, the whole process of exchange, the metamorphosis of the commodity, alters nothing in this. It alters only the form of the use value in which this 12 hours labor time appears. The value of labor is therefore equal to the value of the product of labor. In the first place, equal quantities of materialized labor are exchanged in the commodities, insofar as they are exchanged at their value. Secondly, however, a certain quantity of living labor is exchanged for an equal quantity of materialized labor, because firstly, the living labor is materialized in a product, a commodity, which belongs to the laborer, and secondly, this commodity is in turn exchanged for another commodity which contains an equally large quantity of labor. In fact, therefore, a certain quantity of living labor is exchanged for an equal amount of materialized labor. Thus, it is not only commodity exchanging for commodity in the proportion in which they represent an equal quantity of materialized labor time, but a quantity of living labor exchanging for a commodity which represents the same quantity of labor materialized. On this assumption, the value of labor, the quantity of commodities which can be bought with a given quantity of labor, or the quantity of labor which can be bought with a given quantity of commodities, could serve as the measure of value of a commodity, just as well as the quantity of labor contained in it, since the value of labor always represents the same quantity of materialized labor as the living labor requires for the production of this commodity. In other words, a definite quantity of living labor time would always command a quantity of commodities which represents an equal amount of materialized labor time. But in all modes of production, and particularly in the capitalist mode of production, in which the material conditions of labor belong to one or several classes, while on the other hand, nothing but labor power belongs to another class, the working class, what takes place is the opposite of this. The product, or the value of the product of labor, does not belong to the laborer. A definite quantity of living labor does not command the same quantity of materialized labor, or a definite quantity of labor materialized in a commodity commands a greater quantity of living labor than is contained in the commodity itself. But as Adam Smith quite correctly takes as his starting point the commodity and the exchange of commodities, and thus the producers initially confront each other only as possessors of commodities, sellers of commodities and buyers of commodities, he therefore discovers, so it seems to him, that in the exchange between capital and wage labor, materialized labor and living labor, the general law at once ceases to apply, and commodities, for labor too is a commodity insofar as it is bought and sold, do not exchange in proportion to the quantities of labor which they represent. Hence he concludes that labor time is no longer the immanent measure which regulates the exchange value of commodities, from the moment when the conditions of labor confront the wage laborer in the form of landed property and capital. He should, on the contrary, as Ricardo rightly points out, have drawn the opposite conclusion, that the expressions quantity of labor and value of labor are now no longer identical, and that therefore the relative value of commodities, although determined by the labor time contained in them, is not determined by the value of labor, since that was only correct so long as the latter expression remained identical with the former. Later on, when we deal with Malthus, we can show how wrong and absurd it would be, even when the laborer appropriated his own product, i.e. the value of his own product, to make this value, or the value of labor, the measure of value, in the same sense in which labor time or labor itself is the measure of value in the value-creating element. For even in that case, the labor which can be bought with a commodity cannot serve as a measure in the same sense as the labor contained in it. One would merely be an index to the other. In any case, Adam Smith feels the difficulty of deducing the exchange between capital and labor from the law that determines the exchange of commodities, since the former, apparently, rests on quite opposite and contradictory principles. And indeed, the contradiction could not be solved so long as capital was set directly against labor, instead of against labor power. Adam Smith was well aware that the labor time expended on the reproduction and maintenance of labor power is very different from the labor which it, i.e. labor power, itself can perform. Thus he himself quotes from Cantillon's essay on the nature of commerce, quote, "The labor of an able-bodied slave is computed to be worth double his maintenance, and that of the meanest laborer cannot be worth less than that of an able-bodied slave." On the other hand, it is strange that Adam Smith did not grasp how little the objection he raises has to do with the law that determines the exchange of commodities for each other. That commodities A and B exchange in proportion to the labor time contained in them is in no way upset by the proportions in which the producers A and B divide the products A and B, or rather their value, between themselves. If a part of A goes to the landowner, another to the capitalist, and a third part to the laborer, no matter what the share of each may be, this does not alter the fact that A itself exchanges with B according to its value. The relation between the labor time contained in the commodities A and B is in no way affected by how the labor time contained in A and B is appropriated by various persons. Quote, "When the exchange of broadcloth for linen has been accomplished, the producers of broadcloth will share in the linen in a proportion equal to that in which they previously shared in the broadcloth." End quote from Poverty of Philosophy. It is this too that later the Ricardians rightly maintained against Adam Smith. Thus the Malthusian John Cazenove says, quote, "Interchange and distribution are distinct from each other. The circumstances which affect the one do not always affect the other. For instance, a reduction in the cost of producing any particular commodity will alter its relation to all others, but it will not necessarily alter its own distribution, nor will it in any way affect theirs. Again, a general reduction in the value of commodities affecting them all alike will not alter their relation to each other. It might or might not affect their distribution. But since the distribution of the value of the product between capitalist and worker is itself based upon an exchange between commodities and labor power, Adam Smith is justifiably startled. The fact that he had also made the value of labor, or the extent to which a commodity or money can purchase labor, the measure of value, has a disturbing effect on Smith's argument when he comes to the theory of prices, shows the influence of competition on the rate of profit, etc. It deprives his work of all unity, and even excludes a number of essential questions from his inquiry. As we shall soon see, however, it did not affect his exposition of surplus value in general, because here he keeps consistently to the correct determination of value by the labor time expended in different commodities. So now to his treatment of the question. But first, we must mention one other circumstance. Adam Smith mixes up different things. First, he states in Book 1, Chapter 5, quote, "Every man is rich or poor according to the degree in which he can afford to enjoy the necessaries, conveniences, and amusements of human life. But after the division of labor, has once thoroughly taken place, it is but a very small part of these with which a man's own labor can supply him. The far greater part of them he must derive from the labor of other people, and he must be rich or poor according to the quantity of that labor which he can command, or which he can afford to purchase. The value of any commodity, therefore, to the person who possesses it, and who means not to use or consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which it enables him to purchase or command. Labor, therefore, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities. Further, quote, they, the goods, contain the value of a certain quantity of labor, which we exchange for what is supposed at the same time to contain the value of an equal quantity. It was not by gold or silver, but by labor, that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased, and its value to those who possess it and who want to exchange it for some new productions is precisely equal to the quantity of labor which it can enable them to purchase or command. Finally, quote, wealth, as Mr. Hobbes says, is power. But the person who either acquires or succeeds to a great fortune does not necessarily acquire or succeed to any political power, either civil or military. The power which that possession immediately and directly conveys to him is the power of purchasing a certain command over all the labor, or over all the produce of labor which is then in the market. It can be seen that in all these passages, Adam Smith confuses the labor of other people with the produce of this labor. The exchange value of the commodity which anyone possesses consists, after the division of labor, in the commodities belonging to someone else which he can buy, i.e. in the quantity of someone else's labor which is contained in them, the quantity of someone else's materialized labor. And this quantity of the labor of others is equal to the quantity of labor that is contained in his own commodity. As he expressly says, quote, the goods contain the value of a certain quantity of labor, which we exchange for what is supposed at the time to contain the value of an equal quantity. The emphasis here is on the change brought about by the division of labor. That is to say, that wealth no longer consists in the product of one's own labor, but in the quantity of the labor of others which this product commands, the social labor which it can buy, the quantity of which is determined by the quantity of labor it itself contains. In fact, only the concept of exchange value is here involved, that my labor now counts only as social labor, and consequently, its product determines my wealth by its command over an equal quantity of social labor. My commodity, which contains a definite quantity of necessary labor time, gives me command over all other commodities of equal value, and therefore over an equal quantity of the labor of others realized in other use values. The emphasis here lies on the equalization brought about through the division of labor and exchange value of my labor with the labor of others. In other words, with social labor. The fact that my labor too, or the labor contained in my commodities, is already socially determined and has fundamentally changed its character escapes Adam. And not at all on the difference between materialized labor and living labor and the specific laws of their exchange. In fact, Adam Smith is here saying nothing more than that the value of commodities is determined by the labor time contained in them, and that the wealth of the owner of commodities consists in the quantity of social labor at his disposal. However, the equating here of labor and product of labor in fact provides the first occasion for the confusion between the determination of the value of commodities by the quantity of labor contained in them and the determination of their value by the quantity of living labor that they can buy. In other words, their determination by the value of labor. When Adam Smith says, quote, his fortune is greater or less precisely in proportion to the extent of his power, or to the quantity either of other men's labor, or, what is the same thing, here is the false identification, of the produce of other men's labor, which it enables him to purchase. He might just as well have said, it is in proportion to the quantity of social labor contained in his own commodity or fortune, as indeed he also says, the goods contain the value of a certain quantity of labor, which we exchange for what is supposed at the time to contain the value of an equal quantity. The word value is here superfluous and meaningless. The false conclusion emerges already in this chapter 5, when, for example, he says, quote, labor alone, therefore, never varying in its own value, is alone the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared. What is true of labor itself, and consequently of its measure, labor time, that the value of commodities is always proportionate to the labor time realized in them, no matter how the value of labor may change, is here claimed for the changing value of labor itself. Here, Adam Smith is examining only commodity exchange in general, the nature of exchange value, of the division of labor, and of money. The parties to the exchange still confront each other only as owners of commodities. They buy the labor of others in the form of a commodity, just as their own labor appears in the form of a commodity. The quantity of social labor which they command is therefore equal to the quantity of labor contained in the commodity with which they themselves make the purchase. But when in the following chapters he comes to the exchange between materialized labor and living labor, between capitalist and worker, and then stresses that the value of the commodity is now no longer determined by the quantity of labor it itself contains, but by the quantity, which is different from this, of living labor of others which it can command, i.e. buy, he is not in fact saying by this that commodities themselves no longer exchange in proportion to the labor time they contain, but that the increase of wealth, the increase of the value contained in the commodity, and the extent of this increase depends on the greater or lesser quantity of living labor which the materialized labor sets in motion. And put in this way, it is correct. Smith, however, remains unclear on this point. Section 2. Smith's general conception of surplus value, the notion of profit, rent, and interest as deductions from the product of the worker's labor. In Chapter 6 of Book 1, Adam Smith passes on from those relations in which it is assumed that the producers confront one another only as sellers and possessors of commodities to the relations of exchange between those who possess the conditions of labor and those who possess labor power alone. Quote, in that early and rude state of society which precedes both the accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land, the proportion between the quantities of labor necessary for acquiring different objects seems to be the only circumstance which can afford any rule for exchanging them for one another. It is natural that what is usually the produce of 2 days or 2 hours' labor should be worth double of what is usually the produce of 1 day's or 1 hour's labor. That is to say, the labor time necessary to produce different commodities determines the proportion in which they exchange for one another, or their exchange value. In this state of things, the whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer, and the quantity of labor commonly employed in acquiring or producing any commodity is the only circumstance which can regulate the quantity of labor which it ought commonly to purchase, command, or exchange for. Consequently, on this assumption, the laborer is a mere seller of commodities, and one commands the labor of another only insofar as he buys the other's commodity with his commodity. He thus commands with his commodity only so much of others' labor as is contained in his own commodity, since both exchange only commodities against each other, and the exchange value of the commodities is determined by the labor time or quantity of labor that they contain. But Adam continues, as soon as the stock has accumulated in the hands of particular persons, some of them will naturally employ it in setting to work industrious people, whom they will supply with materials and subsistence, in order to make a profit by the sale of their work, or by what their labor adds to the value of those materials. Stop, before we follow the passage further. In the first place, whence come the industrious people who possess neither means of subsistence nor materials of labor, people who are hanging in midair? If we strip Smith's statement of its naive phrasing, it means nothing more than capitalist production begins from the moment when the conditions of labor belong to one class, and another class has at its disposal only labor power. This separation of labor from the conditions of labor is the precondition of capitalist production. Secondly, however, what does Adam Smith mean when he says that the employers of labor set laborers to work in order to make a profit by the sale of their work, or by what their labor adds to the value of the materials? Does he mean by this that the profit comes from the sale, that the commodity is sold above its value? That is what Stewart calls profit upon alienation, which is nothing but a vibration of wealth between parties? Let him answer for himself. In exchanging the complete manufacture, either for money, for labor, here again is a source of new error, or for other goods, over and above what may be sufficient to pay the price of the materials and the wages of the workmen, something must be given for the profits of the undertaker of the work, who hazards his stock in this adventure. We shall return to this hazarding later, in the chapter on the apologetic accounts of profit. This something given for the profits of the undertaker, when the complete work is exchanged, does it come from the sale of the commodity above its value? Is it Stewart's profit upon alienation? The value, Adam continues immediately, which the workmen add to the materials, therefore, resolves itself in this case, when capitalist production has begun, into 2 parts, of which the one pays their wages, the other the profits of their employer upon the whole stock of materials and wages which he advanced. Here, therefore, Adam Smith explicitly states The profit which is made on the sale of the complete manufacture originates not from the sale itself, not from the sale of the commodity above its value. It is not profit upon alienation. The value, that is, the quantity of labor which the workmen add to the material, falls rather into two parts. One pays their wages, or is paid for through their wages. By this transaction, the workmen give in return only as much labor as they have received in the form of wages. The other part forms the profit of the capitalist. That is, it is a quantity of labor which he sells without having paid for it. If, therefore, he sells the commodity at its value, that is, for the labor time contained in other words, if he exchanges it for other commodities in accordance with the law of value, then his profit originates from the fact that he has not paid for a part of the labor contained in the commodity, but has nevertheless sold it. Adam Smith has thereby himself refuted the idea that the circumstance that the whole product of his labor no longer belongs to the laborer, that he is obliged to share it, or its value, with the owner of capital, invalidates the law that the proportion in which commodities exchange for each other, or their exchange value, is determined by the quantity of labor time materialized in them. Indeed, on the contrary, he traces the profit of the capitalist precisely to the fact that he has not paid for a part of the labor added to the commodity, and it is from this that his profit on the sale of the commodity arises. We shall see how further on Adam Smith even more explicitly derives profit from the labor performed by the workman over and above the quantity of labor with which he pays for his wages, that is to say, replaces it by an equivalent. Thereby he has recognized the true origin of surplus value. At the same time, he has expressly stated that it does not arise from the advanced funds, whose value, however useful they may be in the real labor process, merely reappears in the product, but that it arises exclusively from the new labor which the workmen add to the materials in the new process of production, in which those funds figure as means of labor, or instruments of labor. On the other hand, the phrase, in exchanging the complete manufacture either for money, for labor, or for other goods, is wrong, and arises from the confusion mentioned earlier. If he exchanges the commodity for money or for a commodity, his profit arises from his selling more labor than he has paid for, from the fact that he does not exchange an equal quantity of materialized labor for an equal quantity of living labor. Adam Smith, therefore, must not put the exchange either for money or for other goods on the same footing as the exchange of the complete manufacture for labor. For in the first exchange, the surplus value originates from the fact that the commodities are exchanged at their value, for the labor time contained in them, which, however, is in part unpaid for. Here, it is assumed that the capitalist does not exchange an equal quantity of past labor for an equal quantity of living labor, that the quantity of living labor appropriated by him is greater than the quantity of living labor he has paid for. Otherwise, the workman's wage would be equal to the value of his product. The profit on the exchange of the complete manufacture for money or commodities, if they are exchanged at their value, arises therefore from the fact that the exchange between the complete manufacture and the living labor is subject to other laws, that no equivalents are exchanged here. These cases, therefore, must not be lumped together. Profit is consequently nothing but a deduction from the value which the workmen have added to the material of labor. They add to the material, however, nothing but a new quantity of labor. The workman's labor time therefore resolves itself into two parts, one for which he has received an equivalent, his wages, from the capitalist, the other which he gives to him gratis, and which constitutes the profit. Adam Smith rightly points out that only the part of the labor which the workman newly adds to the material resolves itself into wages and profit. That is to say, the newly created surplus value in itself has nothing to do with the part of the capital which has been advanced as materials and instruments. Adam Smith, who has thus reduced profit to the appropriation of the unpaid labor of others, at once goes on to say, the profits of stock, it may perhaps be thought, are only a different name for the wages of a particular sort of labor, the labor of inspection and direction. And then he refutes this false view of the labor of superintendents. We shall return to this later in another chapter. Here it is only important to stress that Adam Smith very clearly recognizes, brings out, and expressly emphasizes the contradistinction between his view of the origin of profit and this apologist view. After pointing out this contradistinction, he proceeds, quote, in this state of things, the whole produce of labor does not always belong to the laborer. He must in most cases share it with the owner of the stock which employs him. Neither is the quantity of labor commonly employed in acquiring or producing any commodity, the only circumstance which can regulate the quantity which it ought commonly to purchase, command, or exchange for. An additional quantity, it is evident, must be due for the profits of the stock which advance the wages and furnish the materials of labor. This is quite correct. Given capitalist production, materialized labor, in the form of money or commodity, always purchases, besides the quantity of labor which it itself contains, an additional quantity of living labor for the profits of stock, which, however, in other words, means nothing but that it appropriates for nothing, appropriates without paying for it, a part of the living labor. Adam Smith is superior to Ricardo in that he so strongly emphasizes how this change begins with capitalist production. On the other hand, he is inferior to Ricardo in that he is never able to free himself from the viewpoint, though it is one he himself refuted by his own analysis, that through this changed relation between materialized labor and living labor, a change takes place in the determination of the relative value of commodities, which, in relation to each other, represent nothing but materialized labor, given quantities of realized labor. After thus presenting surplus value in the one form, the form of profit, as part of the labor which the worker performs, over and above the part of the labor which pays his wages, he does the same with the other form of surplus value, the rent of land. One of the objective conditions of labor alienated from labor, and therefore confronting it as another man's property, is capital. The other is the land itself, the land as landed property. Therefore, after dealing with the owner of capital, Adam Smith continues, as soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed, and demand a rent even for its natural produce. The laborer must give up to the landlord a portion of what his labor either collects or produces. This portion, or it comes to the same thing, the price of this portion, constitutes the rent of land. Like industrial profit proper, rent of land is only a part of the labor which is added by the laborer to the materials and which he gives up, hands over to the owner of the land without being paid for it. Hence, only a part of the surplus labor performed by him over and above the part of the labor time which he works to pay his wages, or to return an equivalent for the labor time contained in his wages. Thus, Adam Smith conceives surplus value, that is, surplus labor, the excess of labor performed and realized in the commodity over and above the paid labor, the labor which has received its equivalent in the wages, as the general category, of which profit, in the strict sense, and rent of land are merely branches. Nevertheless, he does not distinguish surplus value as such as a category on its own, distinct from the specific forms it assumes in profit and rent. This is the source of much error and inadequacy in his inquiry, and of even more in the work of Ricardo. Another form in which surplus value appears is interest on capital, interest on money. But this interest on money is always, Adam Smith says in the same chapter, quote, a derivative revenue, which, if it is not paid from the profit which is made by the use of the money, must be paid from some other source of revenue, therefore either rent or wages. In the latter case, assuming the average wage, it does not originate from surplus value, but is a deduction from the wage itself. Or, and in this form, as we shall later have occasion to see, it appears in undeveloped capitalist production, it is the only form of profit. Unless perhaps the borrower is a spendthrift who contracts a second debt in order to pay the interest of the first. Interest is therefore either a part of the profit made with the capital lent, in this case it is only a secondary form of profit itself, a branch of profit, and thus only a further division between different persons of the surplus value appropriated in the form of profit, or it is paid out of rent, in which case the same holds good, or the borrower pays interest out of his own or someone else's capital, in which case it in no way constitutes surplus value, but is merely a different distribution of existing wealth, vibration of the balance of wealth between parties, as in profit upon alienation. Excluding the latter case, when interest is not in any way a form of surplus value, and excluding the case where it is a deduction from the wage or itself a form of profit, Adam Smith does not mention this latter case, interest is therefore only a secondary form of surplus value, a mere part of profit or of rent, affecting merely their distribution, and therefore also is nothing but a part of unpaid surplus labor. The stock which is lent at interest is always considered as a capital by the lender. He expects that in due time it is to be restored to him, and that in the meantime the borrower is to pay him a certain annual rent for the use of it. The borrower may use it either as a capital or as a stock reserved for immediate consumption. If he uses it as a capital, he employs it in the maintenance of productive laborers, who reproduce the value with the profit. He can, in this case, both restore the capital and pay the interest without alienating or encroaching upon any other source of revenue. If he uses it as a stock reserved for immediate consumption, he acts the part of a prodigal and dissipates in the maintenance of the idle what was destined for the support of the industrious. He can, in this case, neither restore the capital nor pay the interest without either alienating or encroaching upon some other source of revenue, such as the property or rent of land. Thus, whoever borrows money, which here means capital, either uses it himself as capital and makes a profit with it. In this case, the interest which he pays to the lender is nothing but a part of the profit under a special name, or he consumes the borrowed money. Then he increases the wealth of the lender by reducing his own. What takes place is only a different distribution of the wealth that passes from the hand of the spendthrift into that of the lender, but there is no generation of surplus value. Insofar, therefore, as interest in any way represents surplus value, it is nothing but a part of profit, which itself is nothing but a definite form of surplus value, that is, unpaid labor. Finally, Adam Smith observes that in the same way, all incomes of persons who live on the proceeds of taxes are paid either from wages, and are therefore a deduction from wages themselves, or have their source in profit and rent, thus representing only claims whereby various social strata share in the consumption of profit and rent, which themselves are nothing but different forms of surplus value. All taxes, and all the revenue which is founded upon them, all salaries, pensions, and annuities of every kind, are ultimately derived from some one or other of those three original sources of revenue, and are paid either immediately or mediately from the wages of labor, the profits of stock, or the rent of land. Thus, interest on money, along with taxes or revenues derived from taxes, insofar as they are not deductions from wages themselves, are merely shares in profit and rent, which are themselves in turn reducible to surplus value, that is, unpaid labor time. This is Adam Smith's general theory of surplus value. In yet another passage, Adam Smith sums up his views on the whole question, making it all the more clear how far he is from even attempting in any way to prove that the value added by the laborer to the product, after deducting the costs of production, the value of raw materials and of the instruments of labor, is no longer determined by the labor time contained in the product, because the laborer does not himself appropriate this value in full, but has to share it, the value or the product, with the capitalist and the landowner. The way in which the value of a commodity is distributed among the producers of this commodity naturally alters nothing in the nature of this value, or in the relative value of commodities to one another. As soon as land becomes private property, the landlord demands a share of almost all the produce which the laborer can either raise or collect from it. His rent makes the first deduction from the produce of the labor which is employed upon the land. It seldom happens that the person who tills the ground has wherewithal to maintain himself till he reaps the harvest. His maintenance is generally advanced to him from the stock of a master, the farmer who employs him, and who would have no interest to employ him unless he was to share in the produce of his labor, or unless his stock was to be replaced to him with the profit. This profit makes a second deduction from the labor which is employed upon the land. The produce of almost all other labor is liable to the like deduction of profit. In all arts and manufactures, the greater part of the workmen stand in need of a master to advance them the materials of their work, and their wages and maintenance till it be completed. He shares in the produce of their labor, or in the value which it adds to the materials upon which it is bestowed, and in this share consists his profit. Here, therefore, Adam Smith in plain terms describes rent and profit on capital as mere deductions from the workman's product, or the value of his product, which is equal to the quantity of labor added by him to the material. This deduction, however, as Adam Smith has himself previously explained, can only consist of that part of the labor which the workman adds to the materials over and above the quantity of labor which only pays his wages, or which only provides an equivalent for his wages, that is, the surplus labor, the unpaid part of his labor. Therefore, incidentally, profit and rent, or capital and landed property, can never be a source of value. Section 3. Adam Smith's extension of the idea of surplus value to all spheres of social labor. We see the great advance made by Adam Smith beyond the physiocrats in the analysis of surplus value and hence of capital. In their view, it is only one definite kind of concrete labor, agricultural labor, that creates surplus value. Therefore, what they examine is the use value of labor, not labor time, general social labor, which is the sole source of value. In this special kind of labor, however, it is nature, the land, which in fact creates the surplus value, consisting in an increase of organic matter, the excess of the matter produced over the matter consumed. They see it, however, still in quite a restricted form, and therefore distorted by fantastic ideas. But to Adam Smith, it is general social labor, no matter in what use values it manifests itself, the mere quantity of necessary labor which creates value. Surplus value, whether it takes the form of profit, rent, or the secondary form of interest, is nothing but a part of this labor, appropriated by the owners of the material conditions of labor in the exchange with living labor. For the physiocrats, therefore, surplus value appears only in the form of rent of land. For Adam Smith, rent, profit, and interest are only different forms of surplus value. When I speak of surplus value in relation to the total sum of capital advanced as profit on capital, this is because the capitalist directly engaged in production directly appropriates the surplus labor, no matter under what categories he has subsequently to share this surplus value with the landowner or with the lender of capital. Thus the farmer pays the landowner directly, and the manufacturer, out of the surplus value he has appropriated, pays rent to the owner of the land on which the factory stands, and interest to the capitalist who has advanced capital to him. There are now still to be examined: 1. Adam Smith's confusion of surplus value with profit, 2. His views on productive labor, and 3. How he makes rent and profit sources of value, and his false analysis of the natural price of commodities, in which the value of raw materials and instruments is not supposed to have a separate existence, and therefore not to be considered, apart from the price of the three sources of revenue. Section 4. Smith's failure to grasp the specific way in which the law of value operates in the exchange between capital and wage labor. Wages, or the equivalent with which the capitalist buys the temporary disposal of labor power, are not a commodity in its immediate form, but the commodity metamorphosed, money, the commodity in its independent form as exchange value, as the direct materialization of social labor, of labor time in general. With this money, the laborer naturally buys commodities at the same price as any other possessor of money, disregarding here such details as, for example, that he buys on less favorable conditions and in worse circumstances, etc. He faces the seller of commodities, as does every other possessor of money, as a buyer. He enters commodity circulation itself not as a laborer, but as pole money facing pole commodity, as possessor of commodity in its general, always exchangeable form. His money is once more transformed into commodities, which are to serve him as use values, and in this process he buys commodities at the current market price, generally speaking at their value. In this transaction, he carries through only the act M to C, which indicates a change of form, but as a general rule, by no means a change in magnitude of value. Since, however, by his labor materialized in the product, he has added not only as much labor time as was contained in the money he received, he has paid not only an equivalent, but has given surplus labor gratis, which is precisely the source of the profit. He has thus, in fact, given a higher value than the value of the sum of money which forms his wages. In return, he has bought with more labor time the quantity of labor realized in the money which comes to him as wages. It can therefore be said that in the same way he has indirectly bought all the commodities into which the money, which is only the independent expression of a definite quantity of social labor time, he received is converted with more labor time than they contain, although he buys them at the same price as any other buyer or possessor of a commodity in its first transformation. Conversely, the money with which the capitalist buys labor contains a smaller quantity of labor, less labor time than the quantity of labor or labor time of the workman contained in the commodity produced by him. Besides the quantity of labor contained in this sum of money which forms the wage, the capitalist buys an additional quantity of labor for which he does not pay, an excess over the quantity of labor contained in the money he pays out. And it is precisely this additional quantity of labor which constitutes the surplus value created by capital. But as the money with which the capitalist buys labor, in the actual result, even though mediated through exchange not with labor directly but with labor power, is nothing other than the transmuted form of all other commodities, their independent existence as exchange value, it can equally well be said that all commodities in exchange with living labor buy more labor than they contain. It is precisely this more that constitutes surplus value. It is Adam Smith's great merit that it is just in the chapters of Book 1, chapters 6, 7, and 8, where he passes from simple commodity exchange and its law of value to exchange between materialized and living labor, to exchange between capital and wage labor, to the consideration of profit and rent in general, in short, to the origin of surplus value, that he feels some flaw has emerged. He senses that somehow, whatever the cause may be, and he does not grasp what it is, in the actual result, the law is suspended. More labor is exchanged for less labor, from the laborer's standpoint. Less labor is exchanged for more labor from the capitalist standpoint. His merit is that he emphasizes, and it obviously perplexes him, that with the accumulation of capital and the appearance of property and land, that is, when the conditions of labor assume an independent existence over against the labor itself, something new occurs. Apparently, and actually in the result, the law of value changes into its opposite. It is his theoretical strength that he feels and stresses this contradiction, just as it is his theoretical weakness that the contradiction shakes his confidence in the general law, even for simple commodity exchange, that he does not perceive how this contradiction arises, through labor power itself becoming a commodity, and that in the case of this specific commodity, its use value, which therefore has nothing to do with its exchange value, is precisely the energy which creates exchange value. Ricardo is ahead of Adam Smith in that these apparent contradictions, in their result real contradictions, do not confuse him. But he is behind Adam Smith in that he does not even suspect that this presents a problem, and therefore the specific development which the law of value undergoes with the formation of capital does not for a moment puzzle him, or even attract his attention. We shall see later how what was a stroke of genius with Adam Smith becomes reactionary with Malthus, as against Ricardo's standpoint. Naturally, however, it is at the same time this deep insight of Adam Smith's that makes him irresolute and uncertain, cuts the firm ground from under his feet, and prevents him, in contrast to Ricardo, from reaching a consistent and comprehensive theoretical view of the abstract, general foundations of the bourgeois system. The above-quoted statement by Adam Smith that the commodity buys more labor than it contains, or that labor pays a higher value for the commodity than the latter contains, is thus formulated by Hodgkin, quote, "Natural or necessary price means the whole quantity of labor nature requires from man, that he may produce any commodity. Labor was the original, is now, and ever will be, the only purchase money in dealing with nature. Whatever quantity of labor may be requisite to produce any commodity, the laborer must always, in the present state of society, give a great deal more labor to acquire and possess it than is requisite to buy it from nature. Natural price, thus increased to the laborer, is social price. We must always attend to the difference between natural and social price." In this presentation, Hodgkin reproduces both what is correct and what is confused and confusing in Adam Smith's view. Section 5. Smith's identification of surplus value with profit, the vulgar element in Smith's theory. We have seen how Adam Smith explains surplus value in general, of which the rent of land and profit are only different forms and component parts. As he presents it, the part of capital which consists of raw material and means of production has nothing direct. Hence, for the wear and tear of the machine-building machine, 7/12 of a yard plus 1/4 of a yard, being 7/12 plus 3/12 at 10/12 of a yard. On the other hand, it would now be quite pointless again to resolve the 3/4 of a yard for wood and iron into their component parts, and to return a part of it once more to the machinery manufacturer.
Well, we sort of reached the end of our allotted time. Don't want to burden us with additional stuff. Otherwise, I could produce it in that sense in an additional recording, which I might do anyway. And let me point out that this particular moment in the recording is only a portion of what is chapter 3. I hope that you can see that Marx is commenting on some putative differences, not only between Smith and Ricardo, but some other comments on what counts as, how do you define surplus value, its relationship to paid and unpaid labor, its relationship to profit, and that these things are not identical, and that they represent things that are sort of between other things, as it were, things that are transitions or moments in the formation of value. And I think that those are all useful observations that are worth pursuing. I will note, of course, that this section, section 5, is we'll take that up at some other moment. It's unclear to me how much further, considering the length of the document. We may do it at faster speed, so you can examine it more closely, or that we get to sort of a summary. And yes, there are numbers that come up, and we've fortunately avoided all of those different numbers being thrown around. For all the usual kinds of reasons, because it's just difficult unless you're writing them down or reading them from paper. So we have perhaps ended at a useful moment in the text, and you can read that further. By next week, perhaps we will look at chapter 4, the next section. We have a lot of pages to go, and as with other readings, we've tried to skip a little bit all the numerical components because simply it's just more difficult to follow. Although I think the conclusion of chapter 3 on constant and variable capital may be actually useful. So we'll see and add a considerable section there. And yes, it does replicate some of the things that are covered in Volume 1 of Capital. Note, of course, that Volume 1 is kind of front-loading the entire issue of Capital, and that Volume 4, or Theories of Surplus Value, is a kind of historical-critical addition or appendix to the three major books of Capital. So we'll consider that further subsequently. Thank you very much for your attention.